Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Northern Ireland's residential sector remains deeply divided, with over 90% of our public housing still segregated on religious grounds. Some of our most polarised estates have more than 80% of residents from the same religious background. Up until the outbreak of the Troubles, most public housing was in entirely mixed estates. However, as the violence worsened, people felt they had to move into places where they felt secure, which ultimately meant moving into highly segregated areas. Public housing estates became more segregated through 30 years of conflict, specifically between 1971 and 91, with little change in trends between 91 and 2001, despite the peace process. And what is more worrying is that recent figures have shown that segregation is now at its highest ever level in 30 years. The fact that an area is perceived as belonging to one side or another of the community results in all sorts of negative economic and social consequences. Loss of investment, paramilitary economy, and people less willing to use basic public services like libraries, cinemas, shops or recreation facilities. Even worse, this interacts with other aspects of poverty to create pockets of multiple deprivation. One thing that I would like to point out is that, contrary to popular belief, segregated housing is not just confined to social housing. There's also a very high level of segregation in private housing. So it's not simply a matter of looking at how we deal with it in social housing, it's a matter that spreads right across the board. In 2010, a report by the Independent Commission on the Future for Housing in Northern Ireland stated that integrated housing should be trumpeted as the key ingredient for a peaceful and prosperous future for Northern Ireland, leaving peace lines and religious ghettoisation of housing that was perpetuated by the Troubles in the past. Indeed, there is significant and consistent support for mixed housing in opinion polls. For example, the most recent Life and Times survey in Northern Ireland shows that 83% of people here would prefer to live in mixed neighbourhoods and believe better relations would result from greater integration. Housing executive tenants are also surveyed every year, and these results are also showing that they want to live in mixed areas. In order to achieve this, Alliance believes that a landmark review of segregation in housing in Northern Ireland needs to be undertaken with a view to producing a housing strategy for the next 20 years. Segregation here has emerged as a result of violence, fear and sectarianism over the past decades. It cannot be reversed quickly, and only a radical review of housing policy can provide the practical tools on how to end sectarian division in housing altogether. So what would a strategy look like that would promote and facilitate equality and sharing in order to eliminate both discrimination and segregation? This will not be a question of setting quotas on every street or house. This would be forcing people to live in artificial environments. We're fully aware that other areas have Chinatowns or Little Italies and areas of ethnic diversity. What is unacceptable is not the specific character of a neighbourhood at a particular time, but the sense that this should be permanent or normal, or that it is forced by either fear or poverty. We want to remove all barriers to mixed living and public space and protect all minorities wherever they are. We welcome the work that has already been undertaken by the Housing Executive around shared housing, such as the Shared Neighbourhood Programme and the signing of Shared Future Charters, and no doubt the Minister will refer to these. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg and a lot more needs to be done. I want to take this opportunity to raise an issue that is of particular concern. The Housing Executive still states on its website that they support the wishes of people who choose to live in single identity or mixed neighbourhoods. This statement is simply not acceptable and undermines a lot of the good work that is going on. How exactly does the Housing Executive support those wishes for single identity neighbourhoods when their focus should be supporting people based on objective need? Let me put it another way. Are we to take it that if people asked for a white-only estate, the Housing Executive would support the wishes of people to live there? What if people objected to disabled neighbours? Would the Housing Executive support these wishes too? Of course not. The perhaps innocent language of the Housing Executive fosters an acceptance of segregation and discrimination. If applied to any other category of person under Section 75, it would be a matter of international disgrace, and this needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. The Housing Executive must promote and protect all housing as mixed. Every house and area should be open to people irrespective of background. Nowhere should be off limits for anyone, and there can be no tolerance of anyone claiming control over territory through the use of flags, etc. This has to be accompanied by a plan to ensure that all public facilities, including schools, shops, parks and workplaces, wherever they are located, are open to all. Shared housing standards need to be created in order to promote good relations and create a diverse, inclusive and aspirational environment in which to live. I appreciate that for new housing executive tenancy agreements, tenants are invited to sign a good neighbourhood agreement, where they pledge to respect and cooperate with their neighbours regardless of their religion, colour or creed. This is a welcome step, but it does not address long-term tenancy agreements, and work needs to be done to amend those existing agreements, and when intimidation occurs, the knee-jerk response of authorities should not be to simply move the victim, but instead to confront the perpetrators. New housing should be designed and built in a manner that is most likely to maximise the potential for sharing, and new housing developments should be openly marketed as mixed or integrated. And this brings me to the recent announcement for housing on the Girdwood site. To say we're disappointed would be a vast understatement. There was a real opportunity to do something really different on this site, to deliver a housing mix which would include social housing distributed by need, and opportunities for both affordable and market rate housing so that the area has a vibrant economic life. But instead of grabbing this opportunity, we have a proposal that will perpetuate a sectarian divide. What a wonderful outcome after 6 years of waiting. Is this seriously the highest level of vision and change that we can muster for the poorer parts of Belfast? Instead of imagination and change, unfortunately we've got the same old from the DUP and Sinn Féin. Why are they continuing to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? I've quite a lot to get through, so no. We all know what Einstein said about that. What we now have is continued segregation of housing under the rhetoric of sharing. I'm not sure at what point these parties will understand that the concept of a shared future is very different to that of a shared out future. I firmly believe that social housing should be allocated based on need alone, and we need to be practical and recognise that this will ultimately mean that there may be more people from one background than another living in the area. That does not mean that the area is not shared. The key task is to ensure that people may live in and use the site freely without belonging to the numerically dominant resident group. The focus should be on making spaces more inclusive and welcoming, and this means having a robust policy on flags, emblems, murals and paramilitary memorabilia. Consideration should also be made for equal access into any site, both for those living in and for those coming into the site, so that there are no chill factors to any access. This is what was required for the Girdwood site. A plan that matched the commitment of parties in Belfast City Council's application for peace funding, which talks of a site which is genuinely open and shared throughout. But this sort of permanent change will only happen when communities, politicians and statutory bodies work together in demonstrating a united policy on what is and what isn't acceptable. And the Minister needs to lead the way on this and deliver results. I accept that shared housing is only one of the ways in which we can tackle our segregated towns and cities. But by changing the neighbourhoods that people grow up in, it would make huge inroads into a truly shared future. Political carve-ups must stop. Building a shared future must be at the forefront of ministerial decisions. And briefly, just in response to the SDLP amendment, I've already stated that all housing should be allocated according to objective need, and that the Girdwood site has the potential for so much more. I've also called for a review to inform the housing strategy to promote and facilitate equality and sharing. So whilst we can agree with the thrust of the amendment, we do not think it adds anything to our original motion, and indeed, if anything, it weakens what we are calling for, and that is an end to segregation. Thank you.
Mr. Mark Durkin to move the amendment.